There are people who look calm from the outside, thoughtful, self-aware, even wise. But inside, something in them never truly sits down. Their body may be in bed, their day may already be over, the conversation may have ended hours ago, and still the mind keeps moving. Replaying, revising, predicting, preparing. Not because something is happening, but because some part of them has learned that something could. And that is the part most people miss. Overthinking is usually described as a bad habit, a weakness, a lack of discipline, a mind that just does not know when to stop. But that description is too shallow for what is really happening. Because in many cases, people do not think too much because they are fragile. They think too much because at some point in their life, not thinking felt dangerous. That is the paradox at the center of this whole pattern. The same mind that makes someone perceptive, emotionally intelligent, careful with words, sensitive to nuance, and deeply aware of other people, can also become the mind that never fully rests. And if that is true, then overthinking is not just a behavior, it is a relationship to uncertainty, a private contract with danger, a nervous system that still believes vigilance is the price of safety. That is why some of the deepest people you will ever meet are also some of the most exhausted. Not because life is objectively harder for them every day, but because they are living with an internal process that rarely stops scanning. They hear one sentence and think about what it meant, what it implied, what it might mean later. They notice a slight change in someone's tone and start constructing possibilities. They revisit a moment that looked small on the surface and keep asking whether they missed something important. Their mind does not simply experience life, it audits it. And the tragedy is that this often looks like intelligence because part of it is, but it is also fear wearing the language of analysis. William James once wrote that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. But for chronic overthinkers, that choice does not feel available in the moment. The thought does not arrive as a suggestion. It arrives as a responsibility. Think about it harder. Go over it one more time. Prepare for what could go wrong. Make sure nothing slips past you. That is why telling someone to just stop thinking almost never works. It misunderstands the role the thinking is playing. The mind is not simply producing noise. It is trying to protect. And to understand why that protection becomes so relentless, you have to go further back. For many people, overthinking does not begin in adulthood. It begins much earlier in environments where life felt emotionally unpredictable. A home where moods shifted without warning. A parent whose reactions were difficult to read. A childhood where mistakes carried outsized consequences. A social world where being caught off guard felt costly. In those conditions, the mind learns something very logical. Stay ahead, read the room, predict the shift, anticipate the danger. Notice the pattern before it becomes pain. So the child becomes observant, hyper-aware, internally rehearsed, good at reading subtle changes, good at spotting tension before anyone names it, good at living 2 steps ahead of the present, and that adaptation can look impressive later in life. These are often the people who seem mature early, deep, careful, self-reflective, emotionally perceptive. But underneath that competence is often a quieter truth. They were not only learning to understand the world, they were learning to survive it. That is why overthinking can feel so hard to put down. Because on some level, it does not feel like overthinking. It feels like staying prepared. This is where the distinction becomes important. There is a kind of reflection that helps a person understand themselves. It gives language to emotion. It turns confusion into clarity. It helps someone metabolize experience. That kind of thinking can be a real strength. But there is another kind of thinking that only circles. It does not deepen understanding. It traps attention. It keeps a person inside the same emotional room with the same unfinished tension, mistaking motion for progress. And the line between those two states is thinner than most people realize. A mind can begin with insight and slip quietly into captivity. That is one of the crueler features of overthinking. It often feels productive while it is happening. The person feels mentally engaged, active, involved. They are not avoiding the issue, at least not on the surface. They are wrestling with it, examining it, turning it over from every angle. But this can create what psychologists sometimes describe as an illusion of progress. The mind feels as though it is moving toward resolution, while in reality it is simply staying in contact with the same unresolved threat. And that illusion is part of what makes the pattern so sticky, because the brain does reward the act of trying to solve a problem, even when the solution never arrives. A small sense of movement, a brief hit of significance, a feeling that if you just stay with it long enough, you might finally become safe. So the cycle reinforces itself. You think because you are uneasy. You feel a little relief because thinking feels like action. Then the relief fades, the uncertainty returns, and the mind goes back in. Not because it enjoys suffering, but because it has confused analysis with protection. Daniel Kahneman's work on the mind showed how easily human beings mistake mental fluency for truth. What feels active can feel convincing. What feels effortful can feel meaningful. And overthinking exploits exactly that vulnerability. It makes endless internal effort feel like control. But control is not the same as peace. And that is the hidden cost. Because many overthinkers are not simply anxious in the ordinary sense. They are often highly sensitive to emotional texture. They notice what others overlook. They hear what was not said. They feel the temperature of a room shift before anyone else names it. They are often strong in cognitive empathy, the ability to imagine what another person might be thinking or feeling. This is why they can seem so emotionally intelligent. They are reading constantly, but perception without resolution becomes exhausting. If you notice more than most people, you also carry more unfinished signals, more possibilities, more interpretations, more internal noise asking to be sorted. That is why some people become tired not because they are confused, but because they are seeing too much all at once. And still, there is another truth beneath even that. The goal of the overthinking mind is rarely truth. It is safety. That matters because truth and safety are not always the same thing. A person can spend hours trying to find the perfect interpretation of a conversation, the exact right explanation for someone's distance, the complete certainty behind a decision, and still come away empty. Not because they are not smart enough, but because some things cannot be solved by cognition alone. Some things have to be tolerated, some have to be felt, some have to be chosen without total certainty, and some have to be released before they make emotional sense. That is the moment many overthinkers struggle with most. Not the complexity of the thought itself, but the humility of not following it all the way down. Because to stop can feel irresponsible. To stop can feel naive. To stop can feel like surrender. But often it is the beginning of a different kind of strength. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Overthinking works in a similar way. If you do not see the survival logic inside it, you will keep calling it personality. You will think, this is just who I am. I am just a person who thinks too much. I am just intense. I am just wired this way. Maybe partly. But maybe what you are calling personality is also history. Maybe what you are calling depth is, in part, adaptation. Maybe what you're calling responsibility is, in part, fear. Maybe what you're calling self-awareness has slowly fused with self-surveillance. And once you begin to see that, something important changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but honestly, you stop trying to win against your thoughts by force. You stop treating every mental alarm like a revelation. You stop assuming that because a thought is urgent, it is wise. This is where many therapeutic approaches, especially acceptance and commitment therapy, become useful. Not because they teach you to erase thought, but because they help you change your relationship to it. Instead of saying, this thought means I must figure something out right now, you begin to notice, my mind is generating a threat prediction? That sounds small. It is not. One stance fuses you to the thought, the other lets you observe it. One says, this is reality. The other says, this is mental activity. That tiny distance can become the difference between being dragged by the mind and witnessing it. And that is often the real beginning of change. Not silence, not instant calm. Just enough distance to realize that the old system is still firing, even when the old danger is gone. This is why healing, in this case, is not about becoming less thoughtful. It is not about becoming shallow, careless, or emotionally numb. It is not about turning off the part of you that notices. It is about teaching that part of you that it no longer has to stand guard every minute of your life. It is about letting intelligence become something other than vigilance. Letting reflection become something other than self-interrogation. Letting rest stop feeling morally wrong, because that may be the deepest wound underneath overthinking. Not that the mind moves too much, but that rest itself no longer feels trustworthy. And if that is true, then the work is not to shame the mind for trying so hard. The work is to understand why it had to see that the pattern made sense, to see that it once served a purpose, to see that it was not weakness, it was strategy. A costly strategy, a lonely one, an exhausting one, but still a strategy. And that recognition matters. Because people do not change deeply when they feel accused. They change when something finally makes sense. So, if you have been calling yourself broken because your mind never seems to turn off, maybe the better question is not, why am I like this? Maybe the better question is, what did this part of me once believe it had to protect? That question carries more compassion, more accuracy, and strangely, more possibility. Because once you understand that overthinking was never just overthinking, you begin to see other things differently too. Not only the way you think, but the way you love, the way you wait, the way you pull back, the way you stay quiet, the way you try to stay one step ahead of disappointment. And that is where this conversation starts becoming bigger than thought itself. Because sometimes the mind is not the only thing that learned to survive.